The frozen mountains of North Korea stretched endlessly under a gray December sky in 1950. Captain Jesse Brown adjusted his flight goggles as his Corsair fighter plane cut through the bitter cold air. Below him, white peaks looked like jagged teeth ready to devour anything that dared to fall from the sky. The temperature had dropped to minus 30 degrees, making every breath feel like swallowing ice. Jesse was part of a routine bombing mission over enemy territory when everything went terribly wrong. His aircraft had been hit by ground fire from Chinese forces hidden in the mountains. Black smoke now poured from his engine, and the controls felt heavy in his hands. He could hear the metal groaning under stress as his plane began losing altitude rapidly. "Mayday, mayday," Jesse called into his radio. "This is Brown. My bird is going down. Engine failure. Looking for a place to set her down." His voice remained calm despite knowing that crash landing in enemy territory usually meant certain death or capture. The Chinese forces showed no mercy to downed American pilots. Thomas Hudner, Jesse's wingman and closest friend, flew alongside him as they searched desperately for a safe landing spot. Tom watched helplessly as Jesse's plane continued to lose height. The two men had trained together, flown countless missions together, and had become like brothers during their time in the Navy. "There," Jesse pointed toward a small clearing between the mountains. "I'm going to try for that flat area." It wasn't much of a landing strip, just a small patch of snow-covered ground surrounded by rocks and trees. But it was their only chance. Jesse's plane hit the ground hard, sliding across the frozen earth before coming to a violent stop against a rocky outcrop. The impact was so severe that it bent the aircraft's frame and trapped Jesse inside the cockpit. Steam rose from the damaged engine as fuel began leaking onto the hot metal. Tom circled overhead, watching for any sign of movement from the wreckage. After what felt like hours but was only minutes, he saw Jesse wave weakly from the cockpit. He was alive but clearly injured and unable to get out of the twisted metal that now imprisoned him. "Jesse, can you hear me?" Tom called through the radio. "I can see you moving. Are you hurt badly?" "My legs are pinned." Jesse's voice came back weakly. "Can't feel them. The controls are jammed against me. Tom, I don't think I can get out of here." There was no panic in his voice, just the calm acceptance of a trained military pilot who understood his situation. Tom knew that Chinese soldiers would soon arrive at the crash site. They had seen the smoke and would be moving toward them through the mountains. Time was running out fast. He also knew that attempting a rescue in this terrain was considered impossible by military standards. The mountains were too dangerous for helicopters and ground forces were too far away. But Tom Hudner was not the kind of man who abandoned his friends. As he flew circles above the crash site, his mind raced through options. Every military protocol told him to return to base and report the location. Every rule said that one pilot should not risk his life for another in enemy territory. Yet as he looked down at Jesse trapped in that wreckage, Tom made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He was going to land his own plane and attempt a rescue, even though it meant almost certain death for both of them. The frozen wasteland below offered no mercy, but friendship demanded everything. Tom Hudner stared down at his friend trapped in the smoking wreckage and made the most important decision of his life. Against every rule in the military handbook, against all common sense, and against direct orders to return to base, he was going to land his perfectly good aircraft in enemy territory. "Jesse, hold on," Tom radioed. "I'm coming down to get you out of there." "Tom, no." Jesse's voice crackled through the radio. "Don't be crazy. You'll just get yourself killed too. Get out of here while you can." But Tom had already begun his descent. He studied the terrain carefully, looking for the smoothest patch of ground near Jesse's crash site. The area was filled with rocks, small trees, and uneven snow-covered ground. Landing here would be like trying to set down on a minefield. As Tom approached the ground, his heart pounded in his chest. He had never attempted anything this dangerous. His Corsair was not designed for rough landings, and the frozen ground offered no forgiveness for mistakes. The slightest error would turn his rescue attempt into a double tragedy. The plane touched down hard, bouncing twice before sliding across the icy surface. Tom fought to keep control as rocks scraped against the aircraft's belly and small trees whipped past his wings. Finally, his plane came to a stop about 50 yards from Jesse's wreckage. Tom quickly shut down his engine and grabbed the emergency axe from his cockpit. He also took his survival kit, knowing they would need every tool available if they were going to survive in this frozen wilderness. The cold hit him like a physical blow as he climbed out of his plane. The wind cut through his flight suit and his breath formed white clouds in the bitter air. Running toward Jesse's crashed plane, Tom could see that his friend was conscious, but in serious trouble. The aircraft's nose had crumpled inward, pinning Jesse's legs beneath twisted metal and broken controls. Worse yet, fuel was still leaking from the damaged tank, creating a serious fire hazard. "Thank God you're here," Jesse said weakly as Tom reached the cockpit. "But you're completely insane for landing in this place." "We've been through worse," Tom lied, knowing this was actually the most dangerous situation either of them had ever faced. He began examining the wreckage, looking for a way to free his friend. The damage was worse than Tom had feared. Jesse's legs were completely trapped beneath heavy pieces of the aircraft's structure. The metal had bent around his limbs like a steel trap. Tom tried pulling on various pieces, but nothing would budge. The cold was making the metal even more rigid and difficult to work with. "I need something to pry this open," Tom muttered, swinging his emergency axe at the twisted metal. Each blow rang out across the silent mountains like a dinner bell for any enemy soldiers in the area, but Tom had no choice. Making noise was a risk they had to take. After 20 minutes of desperate work, Tom had barely made a dent in the wreckage. His hands were going numb from the cold, and he could see that Jesse was getting weaker. Blood had frozen on his friend's face and his lips were turning blue from the extreme temperature. "Tom," Jesse said quietly, "you need to leave me here and save yourself. The Chinese will be here soon and there's no point in both of us dying." "I'm not leaving without you," Tom replied firmly, continuing to hack at the metal with his axe. "We're both getting out of here." But even as he spoke those words, Tom knew they were in serious trouble. The wreckage was too heavy and too twisted for one man to move. They needed heavy equipment, cutting tools, and more manpower. Most importantly, they needed time. And time was the one thing they didn't have. In the distance, Tom could hear sounds that made his blood run cold. Voices speaking in Chinese were echoing across the mountains, getting closer with each passing minute. The Chinese voices grew louder as Tom desperately continued his rescue efforts. His emergency axe was proving useless against the thick steel that trapped Jesse's legs. Every swing seemed to accomplish nothing except creating sparks and noise that would draw enemy soldiers directly to their location. "How far away do you think they are?" Jesse asked, his voice growing weaker from cold and blood loss. Tom paused his frantic chopping to listen. The voices seemed to be coming from multiple directions now, suggesting that Chinese forces were surrounding the crash site. "Maybe 15 minutes if they're moving carefully through this terrain," he estimated. Jesse closed his eyes and leaned back against his seat. "Tom, you've done everything you could." "More than anyone should have asked. You need to get back to your plane and get out of here." "Stop talking like that," Tom snapped, attacking the wreckage with renewed fury. But privately, he was beginning to realize that Jesse might be right. The metal was simply too strong and too twisted for him to move with basic tools. That's when Tom heard the most beautiful sound he had ever experienced in his life, the distant rumble of aircraft engines approaching from the south. He looked up to see several Navy planes heading toward their position. "This is rescue control," a voice crackled over Tom's radio. "We have your position and are sending assistance. Hold tight, gentlemen." Tom felt a surge of hope as he saw a helicopter approaching in the distance, but his heart sank when he realized the terrain was too rough for a normal landing. The helicopter circled overhead, its pilot clearly struggling to find a safe place to set down among the rocks and uneven ground. "Negative on landing," the helicopter pilot radioed. "Terrain too rough. We're going to have to try a rope rescue." A thick rope dropped from the helicopter as it hovered 20 feet above the crash site. The downdraft from the rotor blades created a whirlwind of snow and debris that made it almost impossible to see. Tom grabbed the rope but quickly realized the problem. Jesse was still trapped in his cockpit and couldn't be moved. "I need cutting equipment," Tom shouted into his radio over the noise of the helicopter. "Heavy tools to cut through aircraft metal." "Stand by," came the reply. "We're going to drop some equipment." A canvas bag came tumbling down from the helicopter, landing in the snow near Tom's position. Inside, he found a small crowbar and some basic tools, but nothing powerful enough to cut through the thick steel that imprisoned Jesse. The helicopter pilot's voice came over the radio with urgency. "We've got Chinese forces moving toward your position from the north. Multiple squads. You have maybe 10 minutes before they reach you." Tom worked frantically with the new tools, but the result was the same. The crowbar gave him better leverage than the axe, but the metal was still too strong and too thick. Worse yet, Jesse was losing consciousness more frequently now, and his skin had taken on a dangerous gray color from the extreme cold. "Tom," Jesse whispered, "promise me something when you get out of here. Tell my wife and daughter that I was thinking about them at the end. Tell them I love them." "You're going to tell them yourself," Tom replied, but his voice lacked conviction. He could see that his friend was dying, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The helicopter above them was running low on fuel and would soon have to return to base. The Chinese voices were getting closer every minute, and despite all of Tom's efforts, Jesse remained trapped in the wreckage with no hope of escape. Tom realized he was facing an impossible choice. He could stay and die alongside his friend, or he could save himself and live with the guilt forever. Either way, Jesse Brown was not going to survive this frozen hell. The sound of rifle shots echoed across the mountains as Chinese soldiers began firing at the helicopter from distant positions. The rescue operation was about to become a battle zone, and time had finally run out. Rifle bullets whistled through the air as Chinese soldiers opened fire on the rescue helicopter. The pilot immediately pulled up to avoid being shot down, leaving Tom and Jesse alone on the ground once again. The rope that had represented their only hope of escape now dangled uselessly in the wind. "Rescue control to ground team," the radio crackled. "Enemy forces have us in their sights. We have to pull back immediately or risk losing the entire rescue operation." Tom looked at Jesse, who had slipped into unconsciousness again. His friend's face was pale as snow, and his breathing had become shallow and irregular. Even if they could somehow free him from the wreckage, Jesse might not survive the helicopter ride back to base. "Tom." Jesse suddenly opened his eyes and spoke clearly for the first time in an hour. "Listen to me carefully. You have to go now. The Chinese will be here in minutes, and if they capture you, this whole mission becomes pointless." "I can't leave you here," Tom replied, his voice breaking with emotion. "Yes, you can," Jesse said firmly. "And you have to. Someone needs to get back and tell our story. Someone needs to make sure the military doesn't abandon other pilots the way they were ready to abandon me." Tom realized that Jesse was right, but accepting it was the hardest thing he had ever done. Every instinct told him to stay and fight, but logic told him that staying meant both of them would die for nothing. The Chinese voices were now close enough that Tom could hear individual words being shouted between the soldiers. They had found the crash site and were moving in for capture or kill. "Take this," Jesse said, removing his dog tags and pressing them into Tom's hand. "Make sure my family knows what happened here. Make sure they know I didn't die for nothing." Tom accepted the dog tags with tears freezing on his cheeks. He had never felt such a combination of grief and helplessness in his entire life. Everything in his training and his character told him to stay with his friend, but everything in his rational mind told him to run. "I'll never forgive myself for this," Tom whispered. "Don't you dare feel guilty," Jesse replied with surprising strength. "You risked your life to try to save me. You landed your plane in enemy territory when everyone else would have flown home. You're the bravest man I've ever known." Tom squeezed his friend's shoulder one last time, then turned and ran toward his own aircraft. Behind him, he could hear Jesse calling out, "Tell them about the pilots who get left behind. Tell them about the ones who never make it home." Running through the snow and rocks, Tom felt like he was moving through a nightmare. Every step away from Jesse felt like a betrayal, but every second of delay meant a greater chance of capture. He could hear Chinese soldiers shouting behind him as they discovered Jesse's crash site. Tom reached his own plane and frantically began the startup sequence. His hands were shaking so badly from cold and emotion that he could barely work the controls. The engine turned over once, twice, then finally roared to life. As his plane lifted off the rough ground, Tom looked back one last time at Jesse's position. He could see Chinese soldiers surrounding the wreckage, but he was too far away to see what was happening to his friend. The flight back to base was the longest of Tom's life. He flew through clouds with tears streaming down his face, knowing that he was returning without the man he had risked everything to save. The radio remained silent. No one knew what to say to a pilot who had attempted the impossible and failed. When Tom finally landed at the naval base, he was met by senior officers who wanted a full report. But all Tom could think about was Jesse's final words and the promise he had made to tell their story. That night, as Tom sat alone in his quarters, he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He was going to make sure that no pilot was ever abandoned again, no matter what the cost or circumstances. Tom Hudner sat across from the commanding officers in a sterile conference room, Jesse's dog tags heavy in his pocket. The debriefing had lasted 3 hours with every detail of the rescue attempt examined and questioned. The officers' faces showed a mixture of admiration and concern as they tried to understand why Tom had violated direct orders. "Lieutenant Hudner," the admiral said slowly, "what you did today was either the bravest or most foolish thing I've seen in 30 years of military service. You risked not only your own life but a valuable aircraft and potentially the entire rescue operation." Tom sat straight in his chair, still feeling the cold of those Korean mountains in his bones. "Sir, I couldn't leave my wingman behind. Jesse Brown was trapped and alive when I made the decision to land. I had to try." "The military doesn't operate on individual heroics," another officer interjected. "We have protocols for a reason. One pilot cannot risk everything for another, no matter how noble the intention. With respect, sir," Tom replied, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. "Jesse Brown died because we don't have adequate rescue procedures for situations like this. We send pilots into combat but abandon them when they get shot down in difficult terrain." The room fell silent. Tom's words had touched on an uncomfortable truth that military leadership preferred not to discuss. Pilots were expected to risk their lives in combat, but the military often lacked the resources or will to risk additional lives for rescue operations. "What exactly are you suggesting, Lieutenant?" the admiral asked. Tom pulled Jesse's dog tags from his pocket and placed them on the table. "I'm suggesting that we create specialized rescue units equipped to handle impossible situations. Jesse didn't have to die in that wreckage. If we had the right equipment and training, we could have saved him." The admiral picked up the dog tags and examined them carefully. "Lieutenant Brown was a good pilot and a good man. But the reality of warfare is that sometimes good men die despite our best efforts. Jesse's last words were about the pilots who get left behind," Tom continued, his voice growing stronger. "He made me promise to tell their story. He made me promise to make sure this doesn't happen to others." One of the younger officers leaned forward. "What kind of specialized rescue units are you talking about? What would they need that we don't already have?" Tom had spent the entire flight back to base thinking about this question. Helicopters designed for rough terrain landings, specialized cutting equipment for freeing trapped pilots, teams trained specifically for combat rescue operations, and most importantly, a military policy that says we never leave anyone behind, no matter how dangerous the rescue. "That's a noble sentiment," the admiral replied, "but the reality is that sometimes the risk is too great. We cannot sacrifice 10 men to save one." "What if that one man was your son?" Tom asked quietly. "What if it was your best friend? How do we decide which lives are worth risking and which aren't?" The question hung in the air like smoke from Jesse's crashed plane. Every man in that room had friends serving in combat zones. Every one of them had wondered what would happen if they were the one shot down behind enemy lines. "Lieutenant Hudner," the admiral said finally, "your actions today will be thoroughly investigated. You may face disciplinary action for violating orders. However, your recommendations about rescue procedures will be forwarded to the appropriate departments for consideration." Tom nodded, knowing that military bureaucracy moved slowly and that any changes would come too late to help the pilots currently serving in Korea. But he also knew that Jesse's death would mean something. If it led to better rescue procedures for future airmen. As Tom left the conference room, he made a second promise to his dead friend. He would continue fighting for better rescue procedures, not just within the military but in the public eye. The American people needed to know about pilots like Jesse Brown, who died not from enemy bullets but from inadequate rescue capabilities. That evening, Tom sat down to write the most difficult letter of his life. He had to tell Jesse's wife and young daughter that their husband and father was not coming home. But he also had to tell them that Jesse's death was not in vain, that it would lead to changes that would save other pilots' lives. The words came slowly, each sentence weighted with grief and responsibility. But as Tom wrote, he felt Jesse's presence encouraging him to tell the complete truth, no matter how painful it might be. 3 months after Jesse's death, Tom Hudner found himself in Washington, D.C., standing before a congressional committee investigating military rescue procedures. The hearing room was packed with reporters, military officials, and families of servicemen who had been lost in combat zones. Tom wore his dress uniform with Jesse's Medal of Honor pinned beside his own decorations. Jesse had been awarded the medal posthumously, making him the first African-American naval aviator to receive the nation's highest military honor. But Tom knew that medals couldn't bring back the dead or fix the broken system that had failed his friend. "Lieutenant Hudner," the committee chairman began, "you've submitted a detailed report about the incident in North Korea and your recommendations for improved rescue operations. Can you summarize your main concerns for this committee?" Tom stood and faced the panel of senators and representatives. "Senators, we are sending brave men into combat with the implicit promise that we will do everything possible to bring them home. But when push comes to shove, we abandon pilots who are shot down in difficult situations." He gestured to a large map showing the mountainous terrain where Jesse had died. "My wingman, Lieutenant Jesse Brown, survived the initial crash. He was alive and conscious for over an hour after going down. We had aircraft overhead, we had rescue helicopters in the area, and we had the approximate location of his position, but we lacked the equipment and procedures necessary to extract him from rough terrain." A senator from Texas leaned forward. "Lieutenant, military operations always involve calculated risks. Surely you understand that we cannot risk additional lives every time a pilot is shot down." "With respect, sir," Tom replied, "we're not talking about suicide missions. We're talking about adequate preparation and equipment. The helicopter that responded to our emergency had no way to land in mountainous terrain and no cutting equipment capable of freeing a trapped pilot from aircraft wreckage." Tom pulled out a folder containing photographs of the crash site and specialized rescue equipment used by other military forces. "The British Royal Air Force has developed helicopter rescue units specifically designed for rough terrain operations. The Army has special forces trained in combat rescue techniques, but Navy pilots flying over hostile territory have no such support." "What specifically are you requesting?" asked a congresswoman from California. "First, specialized rescue helicopters, equipped with winches, cutting tools, and medical equipment. Second, training programs for combat rescue specialists who can extract pilots from any terrain or situation. Third, a military doctrine that states unequivocally that we do not abandon downed airmen, regardless of the difficulties involved in rescue." The committee members exchanged glances. Tom could see skepticism in some faces, but also genuine concern in others. The story of Jesse's death had captured public attention, particularly because it highlighted both racial integration in the military and the heroic friendship between the two pilots. "Lieutenant Hudner," the chairman said, "implementing your recommendations would require significant funding and resources. In your opinion, is this expense justified?" Tom thought about Jesse's final words and the promise he had made. "Sir, every pilot who climbs into a cockpit and flies into enemy territory deserves to know that his country will move heaven and earth to bring him home if he's shot down. That's not just a military necessity, it's a moral obligation." The hearing continued for 2 more hours, with Tom answering detailed questions about equipment specifications, training requirements, and operational procedures. He had spent months researching these topics, corresponding with rescue specialists from other military branches and allied countries. After the hearing, Tom was approached by a group of military wives whose husbands were serving in Korea. "Lieutenant," one woman said, "thank you for fighting for our men. It means everything to know that someone is working to bring them home safely." Tom shook her hand, thinking about Jesse's wife and daughter. "Ma'am, this isn't just about the men we might save in the future. It's about honoring the memory of the ones we've already lost." That evening, Tom received a phone call from the Pentagon. A general informed him that preliminary approval had been given for a pilot program to test combat rescue procedures and equipment. It wasn't everything Tom had requested, but it was a beginning. "Lieutenant," the general said, "you've shaken up a lot of people with your testimony today. There are those who think you're a troublemaker, but there are others who believe you're exactly the kind of officer we need leading these new rescue units." Tom felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Jesse would never know that his death had led to changes that would save other pilots' lives. But somewhere in the Korean mountains, his sacrifice was beginning to mean something larger than anyone had imagined. 5 years later, Tom Hudner stood on the deck of an aircraft carrier watching a rescue helicopter return from a successful mission. The pilot being helped from the aircraft had been shot down over enemy territory just hours earlier, but the new combat rescue squadron had extracted him within 30 minutes of receiving the distress call. The rescued pilot was bruised and shaken, but alive, thanks to the specialized equipment and training that Tom had fought to implement. The rescue helicopter was equipped with terrain landing gear, medical facilities, and cutting tools capable of freeing trapped airmen from any situation. Another successful extraction. "Sir," the rescue squadron commander reported to Tom, who now held the rank of commander and served as the program's director. "The pilot was trapped in his cockpit after a hard landing, but our team had him free in 15 minutes. Tom nodded, feeling a deep satisfaction mixed with lingering sadness. Every successful rescue was a victory, but it also reminded him of the friend he couldn't save. Jesse Brown's sacrifice had become the foundation for a rescue program that had already saved dozens of lives. The rescued pilot approached Tom as he was being escorted to the medical bay. "Commander Hudner, I wanted to thank you personally. I know about Lieutenant Brown and what you did to create these rescue units. I owe my life to both of you." "You don't owe us anything," Tom replied. "You did your job and we did ours. That's how it should work." Later that evening, Tom sat in his quarters writing his weekly letter to Jesse's widow and daughter. He had continued this correspondence for 5 years, updating them on the progress of the rescue program and sharing memories of their husband and father. "Dear Daisy and Pamela," he wrote, "another pilot came home safely today because of the rescue procedures Jesse's sacrifice helped create. The new squadron has now completed over 200 successful extractions, including some from terrain that would have been impossible to reach 5 years ago." Tom paused in his writing, remembering Jesse's final words about the pilots who get left behind. Jesse always believed that military service was about looking out for each other, regardless of rank, race, or background. The rescue program has become a living example of that principle. He continued, "The squadron has a motto that Jesse would have appreciated, that others may live." Every rescue specialist learns about Jesse's story during training. They understand that their mission exists because one pilot was willing to risk everything for his wingman, even when the odds were impossible. The next morning brought news that filled Tom with both pride and sorrow. The Secretary of the Navy had announced that a new class of rescue helicopters would be named the Jesse Brown class, honoring the pilot whose death had inspired the entire combat rescue program. Tom called Jesse's widow to share the news. "Daisy, they're naming the new helicopters after Jesse. Every time one of these aircraft saves a pilot's life, Jesse's name will be part of that mission. He would have been so proud," she replied, her voice emotional but strong. "Jesse always said that military service was about something bigger than yourself. I think he would be amazed to know that his story led to saving so many others. He'd probably make a joke about being famous," Tom said, smiling at the memory of his friend's sense of humor. That afternoon, Tom received orders for his next assignment. He was being promoted to captain and given command of a new naval air station. It was a significant career advancement, but Tom knew that his most important work was already complete. As he prepared to leave the carrier, Tom walked to the spot on deck where he had first learned about Jesse's crash 5 years earlier. The ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, reminding him of the vast sky where he and Jesse had flown together as wingmen. Tom pulled Jesse's dog tags from his pocket. He had carried them every day since that terrible morning in Korea. But now it was time to let them go home where they belonged. 3 weeks later, Tom stood beside Jesse's grave in a military cemetery, with Jesse's widow and daughter beside him. He placed the dog tags on the headstone and stepped back to salute his fallen friend. "Mission accomplished, Jesse," he said quietly. "No one gets left behind anymore." As they walked away from the grave, Jesse's daughter, now 10 years old, took Tom's hand. "Uncle Tom," she said, "Mama told me that you and Daddy saved a lot of pilots together." Tom smiled down at her. "Your father was the bravest pilot I ever knew. And yes, we're still saving people together." The combat rescue program that began with one man's refusal to abandon his friend had grown into a cornerstone of military operations. The motto, "that others may live," had become more than words. It was a sacred promise that no American serviceman would ever be left behind in enemy territory. Jesse Brown's name lived on in every successful rescue, every pilot brought home safely, and every family reunited because someone had cared enough to risk everything for a friend.